I always loved that jazz harmony is full of amazing chord progressions that have a natural flow, but still contain some surprising sounds that make them interesting to listen to. But how do you write chord progressions like that? You don't want to play something that's completely random, and if you're looking for lessons, then you'll probably find hundreds of lessons on 2-5-1s, and while that is a very important progression, you also want to be able to play other things. I was always messing around with writing music and putting chords together, also before I was playing jazz. Probably because I couldn't really play a lot of stuff, so I had to experiment and improvise to have something to play. The problem I kept having there was that I didn't really know what chords would fit together, at least not beyond the 1-4-5 chords of the key, and even that I didn't know that well. So it would be more about luck and a lot of messing around before I created a chord progression that I really liked. Most of that is about having a better foundation, and it's pretty amazing how far that will take you in terms of finding a lot more chords and some more interesting sounds that work together. I could probably also use some sort of strategy to help me, because I actually just put stuff together at random. I didn't really know what I was doing. Let's look at finding some interesting chords and then talk about how to fit them together. I'm going to start with a few basic things and then expand that really a lot. The basic process works for any scale, and knowing this is useful in so many ways, so that's definitely something you want to check out. If you start with a major scale, like C major, then you have one chord for each note in the scale. You build the chords by stacking thirds. So for C major, that will give you these triads. And then add another note, a third above, and you get a seventh chord. The diatonic chords are pretty basic, and it's going to get a lot more colorful, but you can already do great things with this. If you have a basic progression going from C major 7 to G7, then you can use the other chords to walk there in steps down the scale. Or you can walk up. Or if you're moving from C major 7 to F major 7, then maybe add an E minor 7 as a step up to F major 7. Let's get a little bit more colorful with the chord choices. The upside to not knowing anything and improvising is that you have no idea what won't fit, and you probably don't mind, so everything is worth a try. The downside is that most of the chords actually don't sound that great. So the key of the music you're creating or playing is a very powerful tool when it comes to creating chord progressions. In this case, the best place to start is to add the chords from the minor key, so C minor. Then I can show you a secret subdominant trick and a fun way to create some wrong chords that make everything weird. For C minor, you have these chords. These are much more fun to add to our C major chord progressions because they fit in there, but they clearly also sound different. Especially the chords that you can use as minor subdominants in major are really great. D half diminished, F minor 7, A flat major 7, and B flat 7. So if I'm going from C major 7 to F major 7, I can of course still add the E minor 7 to take me up to F, but I can also use an A flat major 7 to get back, and that will give me this progression. And this actually works with pretty much all the minor subdominant chords. For example, B flat 7. And I'm using the minor subdominant chord as a surprising sound that isn't really dissonant but still resolves back to the tonic chord. But you can also use them to get to the dominant, like this. Now that you have a few more chords to use, then we can talk a bit more about how to put chords together in a progression. And this is useful if you're making your own songs, but it's actually also important if you're making your own chord melody arrangements or want to add a more personal color to an intro or an outro. There are two ways that you can put together chords quite easily, but keep in mind that they're not rules. If you play something else and it sounds good, then of course that's fine. In fact, I'm going to sort of break these rules later in the video as well. Chords sound great when they move in fourth or fifth intervals. Take a song like Autumn Leaves. All the chords are moving in fifth or fourth intervals, depending on whether you want to see it as moving up or down, and there's a really strong natural flow in there. That is also how I started with the basic chords, going from C major 7 to G7 or C major 7 to F major 7. The other approach is to move the chords in steps. Now, you already saw examples of this, but here's another one which is really sort of a stepwise variation of a 2-5-1. And instead of having several steps next to each other, you can also just use stepwise motion as a sort of leading note, so just a single chord before the next one, like this. And like this, you can put the chords together in progressions with a really strong natural flow. The next type of chord, before I start breaking the rules, is really a bit overlooked, which is useful because then we can sound different from everybody else. You already know about the diatonic chords and some of the minor subdominants, but you actually also have a sharp 4 subdominant type of chord, where the most common ones would be the sharp 4 diminished and the sharp 4 minor 7 flat 5. And these are really amazing ways to get some other sounds into the progression, just more variation together with the regular subdominants and the minor subdominants. I think the classic example is probably this chord progression. But you can also work with it in a progression like this, going from A minor to C major 7. Notice that here I'm actually turning the E minor 7 into an inversion to get stepwise movement in the bass. And that's another thing you can also do to get your chord progressions to flow better. Explore making some of them inversions so that the bass becomes stepwise movement. The other common sharp 4 subdominant chord is a diminished chord that you probably know from this chord progression. But it actually sounds amazing as a suspension as well, if you use it in an inversion like this. And that's actually something that you also want to explore a bit, using suspensions. If you have a chord progression that is sort of very clearly moving to something, like a 2-5-1 that wants to resolve to the 1 chord, then instead of going to that 1 chord, you play something else so that the listener gets surprised because they're expecting to go to one specific sound, and then they get something else, and then you resolve it later. And that can be a very, very powerful thing to do in a chord progression. It can also be great to sometimes be less obvious. Check out this progression and see if you can recognize all the chords in there. It's starting on C major 7 and it's ending there as well. The second chord is a G triad with a B in the bass, so an inversion to create a stepwise bass melody. Then we get the A minor, which is fairly easy to recognize, and then the chord with the A flat in the bass, which is a little bit less clear, but in fact that's an F minor 6 with A flat in the bass, so with a third in the bass, which makes maybe a little bit more sense than trying to call it an A flat 6 with a flat 5. And it's just a nice change instead of playing an F minor 7 or going to an A flat major 7. Sometimes you want to search for a sound that's a little bit more surprising than the stuff that you already know. But a much more exciting and less typical idea is to make the chord progression more vague by changing the bass note so that you don't have a too obvious connection. Check out how this sounds. This works and sounds great, but it doesn't really make any sense. What is happening here is that I'm taking a G7 altered and then using a flat 9, so the A flat, as a bass note, which creates that A flat minor 6. The voice leading still works, but it just doesn't sound like a basic 5-1 movement anymore. A variation of this is that you can take a turnaround and make it much more interesting by turning a G7 altered into an F half diminished chord, which will then eliminate most of that 1-6-2-5 sound. but you do need to couple it with an E minor 7 to justify the bass being an F. As you already saw from the beginning of this video, then I tend to start with a few chords and then find a way from chord to chord, adding more harmony and more color to make it interesting to listen to. And this is a really strong principle, but you need to be able to reduce chord progressions to those basic chords to have access to that freedom. Using functional harmony is a very powerful tool for this, and you can check out how to use that and also some approaches from Barry Harris and Pat Martino in this video.